Hi everybody, before we look at solutions to various market failures, it's very important that you always have in the forefront of your mind the idea of government failure. All of the policies we're going to look at mean that governments will be intervening in markets, and that might not be the best thing even if there is a market failure. And that's because government failure is when the costs of government intervention in a market outweighs the benefits that come from that intervention. And the real problem is that if that happens, there'll be a worsening of the allocation of scarce resources, and that will be harming social welfare. And that will make things worse if there is already a pre-existing market failure. So even if there is a pre-existing market failure, we're not questioning the intentions of government intervention, we are questioning the end outcomes of intervention. And if government failure results, they will make things worse for government. They will worsen the misallocation of resources that already exist, and they will worsen the impact on social welfare. Wow, it's a very powerful argument, government failure, for no government intervention whatsoever, even if there is a market failure. So you guys need to bear that in mind, that when you look at all the policies, you've got to consider that is the problem so great that it requires government intervention? If government intervention does come in, is the risk of government failure significant or not? If it's not, then maybe it is worthwhile intervention. Maybe the benefits will exceed the costs, in which case fine. But if the costs will exceed the benefits, maybe it's an argument to not have government intervention whatsoever. That's the power of government failure in your head as a concept. Then you've got to understand, okay, when can government failure occur? When can the costs of intervention outweigh the benefits? 4 causes come to mind. 4 dominant reasons exist for government failure occurring. The first one is that governments, politicians, policy makers will not necessarily have full information. It's a terrible assumption that we make, that governments, politicians are experts when it comes to making policy decisions. Experts looking at certain markets and deciding on the right kind of policy to use. Completely false assumption that we're making there. Politicians can severely lack the information required to make effective policy decisions, especially when valuing externalities, negative externalities and positive externalities. Perfect policy will be to internalize externalities. We'll make sure that externalities are being accounted for in the price, to make sure therefore that quantity is at the socially optimum level. But if those externalities can't be valued accurately, we might get wild policy that's maybe too strict, that's too high, or maybe too lax, too low. In which case there might be government failure, the policy might be very ineffective with significant costs outweighing the benefits of the policy. The next thing to consider is that very simply the costs of the policy directly might be extremely high. Costs of administration, costs of enforcement, and these 4 policies really do come to mind. Regulation has got significant administration and enforcement costs. If the government can't enforce regulation, then absolutely the costs of the policy are going to significantly outweigh the benefits, because people will know that they can go against the regulation and not be caught. So regulation has got significant costs, both in admin and enforcement. Subsidies, huge costs involved with subsidies, and state provision, huge costs. Price controls, often huge costs involved, yes, in enforcing that the price controls are actually being adhered to, but also in sorting out the problems that price controls cause. So all of these policies have got significant costs. There is a big risk of government failure with these policies for those reasons, so bear that in mind. Next, we have a look at unintended consequences. Unintended consequences is a huge source of government failure. It's another time where we don't question the intentions of government, the intentions of politicians, we just look at what happens at the end. And often politicians can overlook things that are very easy to think about if the policy's been thought through properly. But if the policy hasn't been thought through properly, if it's just been kind of implemented quickly, with not careful consideration, we can get quite severe unintended consequences, which means that the costs of the policy could well outweigh the benefits. So what are the common unintended consequences from a variety of policies? Black markets is certainly number 1. Look at taxation, look at regulation, and some others. Minimum prices, for example, which might lead to black markets existing. We see that in the UK with cigarettes, with alcohol, very large black markets existing there. Also, you look at the impact, negative impacts on people that are not part of the policy. So impacts on the poor of regressive taxation of minimum prices as a good example. Look at the impact on firms of over-strict regulation, of taxation as well, and the impact it can have on firms. Maybe they shut down, maybe they decrease in size, maybe they relocate. And therefore, what impact might that have on employment? Could that lead to unemployment? These are all unintended consequences of whatever policies they may be, but certainly could lead to government failure. Another good example of unintended consequence is if you take subsidy, for example, firms becoming dependent on subsidies. Maybe firms becoming more wasteful in their production because of subsidies. That's an unintended consequence and significantly costly for the government there. Big source of government failure right there. If you take things like state provision, the unintended consequence of the excess demand. There are so many times you can look at unintended consequences for any policy really, so always bear that one in mind. A great example of when the intention is not at fault, it's just the means that is used by the government, the policy used, may be at fault there. So keep that in mind. And then the final source of government failure, really major source, is regulatory capture. This one occurs when governments try and regulate monopoly power. Regulatory capture occurs when basically the interests of society are overlooked for the interests of CEOs and managers and firms in the industry. And that occurs basically when CEOs and managers influence the regulator. Maybe they're in close contact. Maybe the regulator used to work in the industry before and therefore knows the CEOs and the managers in the industry. But basically the CEOs and the managers can influence the regulator to reduce the extent of the regulation, working in the interest of the firm and not in the interest of society. And clearly there, especially when regulatory authorities are very expensive to maintain, the costs can outweigh the benefits right there of monopoly regulation, leading to government failure. So such an important topic is government failure. Know it very well, use it in your essays to evaluate whether government intervention really is necessary or not, even if there is a market failure. Thank you so much for watching this video, guys. I'll see you all in the next one.